Here we
So,
are.
Saikat, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I know you
Are
are much
much
more.
more in tune with your new book,
And
Scent of God. I'd like to move you back to one of my favorites, The Firebird. So it's your previous book.
I guess the first question, a simple question to lead us into our conversation would be tell us about the second name, because my students here are, trying to get the book or have got the book, and it's called The Playhouse. So, what made, tell us about the two titles, if you
Yeah, well, thank you
can.
for your, I think your engagement with the novel has been one of the most, most amazing. I mean, ever since you read it, I've been very grateful for that. And it's let me see new things about my book, which I didn't know. About the title, titles are, I've realized how little control writers have over their titles. It's something which, publishers control more. So this was very much a decision of the American publisher. Um, they started coming up with very strange reasons like the Firebird is a sports car in America. People are not
Is
going to
it?
think
I would
of
not have known that.
but they came up with I mean, they actually wanted to call it Dusk, which, as you know, is the title of the
Yes.
play in the novel. And I'm like, no, I'm not going with Dusk. That's so. Then I suggested the name Playhouse
Okay.
because they just basically they were against the Firebird. I think the real fear was even when the American edition comes out, people are going to get the Indian edition in the US, which is still cheaper,
Yeah,
and with Kindle. So they wanted to kind of just have a different book, and they edited it and they prepared it. So it's copy edited slightly
I
better.
see.
But I suggested the title Playhouse. I
Yeah.
like the pun on it. So obviously it is playing house,
Okay.
which I imagine in some senses Garima as doing. She's
Mm-hmm.
a mother and a wife, and yet she's not very good at it. So she's kind of playing house, but also in the sense play house as a theater. Word. And I thought I'm still much fonder of the title, The Five. I thought I'm still much fonder of the title, The Firebird. I was basically told by my publisher that you have to change the over than dusk. I went with that. Yeah. And Graham Greene was once told to change the title, and he wrote back to his agent saying, "Oh no, I don't want to change the title. Much easier to change publisher." You know, but it didn't.
The question is, was it at the beginning of his career, or was it a bit later when he was very
Probably not.
established?
Probably not.
Yeah,
When he definitely had a lot more clout.
yeah. Um, so, there are so many things to talk about this book, which I just absolutely, each time I read it, I just love it even more. Though I think that that's sometimes not possible because I started off by being really drawn into the book for a number of reasons.
I suppose what remains the most fascinating aspect of this book is really the craftsmanship of the narrative. When you think about it, this is really quite a mature piece of writing when you take into account the fact that it is your second book. And so that's something that continues to draw me in. And I think the fact that you're a critic plays into it as well, because it brings a particular consciousness of how you write.
Ori that makes him incredibly mature, like the mature writer that I was alluding to being you, is that he has an ability to, um, even though it makes him ill, he has an ability to carry contradiction. You're like, what are you saying? I'll give you an example. Um, so he goes in, this is early in the book, and I'm actually going to stick to the earlier part because I think that's what our students will have read. So to focus on that, but we'll consider the whole novel as well. So he, early in the book, the Ori goes to see his mum behind in the green room, And he says he sort of has this fascination for his mother. We see that there's a bit of distance. He doesn't run into her arms and say "mummy," and she doesn't come to him. So there's that beautiful sort of tension in the way he looks at her and admires her. And he says, he went into the green room. This on page 2. You don't need to look at it. You know the novel, or you may not remember it. He had seen her suffer a life of misery and meet her death with calm. He's talking about what he had just witnessed on stage, which is always really kind of unnerving, even after obviously the beginning. We're not going to talk about that, but the beginning is so striking. Let me just read that so that disaster came early in Ori's life at the age of 5, the first time he saw his mother die. I mean, that's just such a sentence from heaven or hell, however you want to put it, but it's one that just like draws you into the story. So he goes to see her, coming back to this moment, and his heart leapt with happiness, comma, and your famous uh, what I think is really characteristic of your writing is after the comma we get something that just completely undoes the previous, and a pang of betrayal. So he's incredibly happy to see her, and you could have put a period there, but there's a comma and a pang of betrayal. And that's very early in the story where we understand that there's something not just mysterious, but something quite amazing about this young boy, because he has the ability to process things at two levels. Carry, I call it that he's able to carry contradiction, but it's also, I think, the thing that makes him ill, he physically ill at many times, is because he's pulled into situations where he has to be two things, or see two things, or know two things that actually don't go together.
Right, right. No, I think that's as usual. That's amazing close reading. I always feel like any character in fiction is always a character in a situation. You can never have a character per se. So
Mm.
just the way we human beings are, we are always in a moment, and another moment we become a different person. Of course, there's a consistency. So I think in this, you're absolutely right. There's a duality in his character, but there's a duality in his life,
Yeah,
and there's a duality in his mother's life. And I think this is the basic theme. If I'm to, I know novels cannot be reduced to themes, but if I
right.
am to say what is the single theme of the novel, I'd say it's the confusion between art and life.
Oh,
And
absolutely, yeah. Mm.
it is the confusion which obviously takes a much more toxic form in Ohin's life. Ohin is a kind of a toxic extension of Ori. But in Ori too, and it starts with the confusion, which is where the line comes from, that he saw his mother die. And that's when he's too young to understand what's happening to his mother. But as you know, he retains this confusion even when he's old enough to know that, okay, she's not really dying. Because at some
Right.
level, he retains the confusion. And he sees that society mirrors this confusion around him. So if his mother is kissing somebody on stage, okay, it's not okay for a woman to do that, from a middle
Mhm.
class family. So obviously different standards for a man doing that. So there's this confusion which also, and there's so many things, I mean, that life and death confusion. um there's also confusion between this initial pride. So early on,
Mhm.
Ori was proud to see his mother on stage. Um, but even the pride would tinged with a sense of, see, he can't possess her. I mean, she's leading a life out there of which he's no part. And that was very hard for a small child to process, that why does she have that life? It's not just about her dying, but why does she have a family there?
Right.
She's doing ordinary things. She's talking of grocery. She has no right to do that without me. um, and then at the same time, as he grows older, especially that encounter when he sees his grandmother and all talking about his mother in a very sort of disdainful way, he realizes that there's something wrong about what his mother does, or at least he comes to believe it. It's very impressionable that what his mother does is, he may be proud, but there are people are ashamed about it, and there are people talking about things may not be okay with her. She may not be a good woman. And that
Yeah.
creates the confusion. So it's a corruption. There was a time when he would have been proud of her. And there's a
He
moment, I think,
touches the
and you
poster.
remember well, when he Yeah, exactly. The poster. He just goes out on the streets as a public display of her name, that her name is all over. And he touches the name. And then at the same time, there's a shiver of pride, but also shame. Like, oh, did somebody see me? And the back of his neck becomes red because he
Mhm.
knows that in the neighborhood, there's this sort of noise about how this woman acts and she comes home late and she spends her evenings with other shadow of an evil, that there's something going on which is not right, and yet he doesn't know what it is. So that duality has been part of his existence throughout, and as he grows older, it never leaves him. And that's of course the stage and the audience. It's that's I guess that's the duality I like about the American title, Playhouse.
That's
You're
true.
playing house, but you're also playing the theater. So you're absolutely right, there is a contradiction in him. There is a maturity in him beyond his age. He's precautious, but it's not a happy precocity.
No.
He's forced to become mature,
In
right?
fact, yeah, I mean, in fact, if we push that idea a little further, it's also the source of his evil, right? I mean, it's the source of, it's the thing that clicks in him that makes him decide that he's going to use his access to these two stories, to this duality, to do
Yeah,
something, right?
exactly.
It's
Exactly,
quite
absolutely.
horrific in the end.
Absolutely, and it's a momentary thing. I mean, he's like, oh yeah, I saw my mother kissing another man. It's like he doesn't say that it was happening in a play, and in
But
a
he
way that
knows that he doesn't say it too. And
he knows. Yeah,
that's what is, I mean, I'm curious whether you introduced that later so that it was very clear, because you could have left it ambiguous that, he said it and she misinterpreted and he didn't realize that it was significant to say that it was on the stage. But in the version we read, and it's not fair of me to do that, but when we read it, it's quite clear that he neglects to tell the grandmother that it was on stage. And he knows that by not telling, he's giving it a different meaning. And he realizes that he can manipulate the world.
right, right. Well, there are certain evil things Ori does which are kind of the spur of the moment till he actually becomes evil, which
Becomes
happens
evil.
with
Yeah.
Shruti's death. But the first two things, one is when he does say that. Remember, there's a there's an element of sort of, what do you call it?
Experimentation, maybe?
I
I'm
know,
not.
I'm thinking of when you are sexually attracted to incest. Incest is a very
Oh,
strong.
yeah.
I forget that word, but incest is a very strong word. I mean, not only about his mother, but also his cousin, and he
Oh,
kind of
yes.
idolizes her, and he's also mad about her boyfriend. So you remember that evening, he was actually getting very mad because she was
He,
out with her boyfriend, and her mother was out. So there's a sense of incestuous exclusion, and
uh, no, go
this is
ahead.
the start thing. I mean, he's 10, so he's kind of attaining puberty. So there's a beginning of stirring, but he's left out of it. So he's in this very strange kind of a jealousy and anger.
Mhm.
And at the same time, he also has to win his grandmother's approval, who he believes is the one person who loves him unconditionally.
Unconditionally, yeah.
So at
That's an
this spur of the moment,
amazing
he says
chapter.
that, and exactly. He probably regrets it because he knows he's unleashed a demon,
Yeah.
but that just happens. He's sitting on a dynamite of emotions at that moment, and he just lets it out. The second time this happens is when he sets the stage on fire with those two girls. He didn't really mean to, that he just, and then this other girl is saying, "Oh, she's looking like she's looking like she's going to hatch an egg." So this whole other, not the sexualization, but the mother is a pregnant woman on stage, that she's going to have a baby, and of course he's the baby, so she has no business having another baby on stage. So there's a kind of a possessiveness over a woman's body. I mean, this is, I think, how little boys become men in a very kind of a toxic process. But that's when he just suddenly sets the stage on fire.
Decides, yeah.
Exactly. So those are the two moments. I thought of those two moments as kind of sort of slow turning points. And of course, the real turning point comes when Shruti,
Oh,
dies. And that's when he has fully crossed over to the dark side. But these moments, I always thought of him as not really there. He's kind of inhabiting this twilight of good and evil. There's still something of the innocent boy who is acting in a vindictive, hurtful way, the way the children do without really being aware of the consequence of their action.
Consequences, yeah. I think that, I hadn't thought of it in that way, but when you just said it, I kind of had been resisting the idea that Ori is sort of like a double image or some kind of incarnation of Ohin. I just didn't want to put them together, uh, because I mean, everything in me was resisting it. He's this young, innocent boy. Yes, he does get corrupted, but Ohin is in some ways the source of his corruption, because he sort of sexualizes him before he knows that he's a sexual being. That early scene when he asks him to take his shirt off.
Right.
Um, and again, you did the same sentence structure, and I can't find it right this minute, but I will. When you say he wanted him for the stage, and there's a comma or there's a period, and you say something else, and I'll find that. That's
I
just
don't mean he's the source of that corruption, but in some ways I think of them as parallel stories. Of
I know
course,
you do. I don't want to do that.
are, and yeah, I mean, of course, he's. But I guess the bigger theme is that theater is such a powerful
Yeah,
medium,
yeah.
and it's powerful in this novel in a destructive way, but still, that's a tribute to its power. That it
Mm-hmm.
dissolves the fourth wall. People just, and as you know, I've told you that this some of it comes from my personal memory of having a mother who was in the stage and having seen the
Mm-hmm.
her in in a makeup, and even watching a play from the wings, it's not something you can even get in film. And that sense of confusion which one
Yeah,
can have, to see somebody wearing makeup or in the makeup room when they've kind of changed their dress, but they're still wearing the hair, that half stage, which I know you know very well also, so which is what both draws us to this book.
yeah.
And that is a kind of a confusion which I think theater can generate. And that's
And I agree in a way that is not the case with film or anything else. Absolutely agree, because
yeah,
it's flesh and blood. It's,
yes,
the
exactly.
sweat that you know and you can see it drip. It's just,
Yeah, the
it's
real time. I mean, I'm sure film creates a different kind of confusion, but you
sure.
know, it's and with someone like Ohin, this obviously has a historical trajectory because he comes from this kind of decadent feudal family where actresses were often prostitutes or concubines, and he can't get that thing off his head. So there are all kinds of other confusions. So there are traditions, when I was in Wellesley writing my other novel, the whole Harvey Weinstein thing
Yeah,
came out, and I thought, this is actually a global phenomenon. Female
absolutely.
performance and the sexualization is all over the place, and yet it happens in a certain way in Indian theater or in Calcutta theater. How there's a tradition of how respectable women couldn't act, so only women who would act would be courtesans, from the red
Right.
light areas, and that memory has never really gone away. So someone like Ohin obviously has that memory that, oh, I could sleep with this actress at any time I wanted to. So when he writes a play, ironically the main character is that of a prostitute. So then he's
Yeah.
now looking for an actress who will
Who
play
will
the prostitute, who is in turn obviously. So there's this cycle goes on forever.
I
So
think you also managed to build up really well the way you just talked about, two narratives can come together. Obviously, the theme of the book, if you want, is the way theater and life comes together. But there are several sort of anticipations of that. And I want to just, I mean, I don't know if you meant to do this. It's hard talking to an author. I always feel sort of self-conscious to say something that, they're saying that, no,
no,
that's
I
really
think
not what I was thinking.
it's established, you clearly established far better things about the novel than I could ever think of. That's for
Well,
sure.
that's
I
the
don't,
way it should be. You write the rich novel, and then we come up with all kinds of theories about it. No, but there are two really early moments when the novel is sort of, I think the novel is sort of playing with this idea of two narratives. One is Shruti is in the telephone booth behind a glass
Mhm,
encasing, and Ori is outside in the beauty parlor watching her.
mhm,
And he's trying to sort of understand what she's saying to her boyfriend.
mhm.
He can't
Yeah.
hear her.
Yeah.
but the voice that he hears is this lewd exchange between this man and the girl, saying, you know, if you rub your breasts against him, he'll give you more money. And so he's hearing this conversation and
Mm.
he's watching Shruti, and it's almost as if these two, this narrative sort of pushing itself onto what she might be saying. That's one moment. And then another moment, which happens in a different way, but it's just absolutely brilliant, is when it's that key scene with the three women, with the two women and the absent mother. They're all present in some way. He's braiding his grandmother's hair.
Mhm.
Shruti comes in. He knows he's been out. We talked about this moment. And every two or three, the two moments when he says, and mother is not there, and where was my mother? So she's also present in her absence, right?
Mhm.
And it's at that time that he's listening to the narrative that his grandmother is telling him, which is the story that they've repeated several times about his grandfather on the ship and he was sick. And so
Mhm.
he's listening to that, right? But he's thinking about Shruti. Where did she go? Did he touch her? Were they in the cinema? Was someone sitting behind them? It's just amazing. And there are these two narratives that are constantly on. And then there's also a suggestion of the third, which is where is his mother? And
Mm.
whereas his mother is related to Shruti, what did she do? Uh, so I think we kind of see early on that this kid is going to be the resolving factor of these of two contradictory or two separated narratives, which establish themselves several times in the story. And we understand that he's going to be the person who has to resolve it, because you give us these, on another level, these contradictions, like he loves sweets and he
Mhm.
goes to this guy and he gives him the rashmalai and stuff like that. And then the nausea of how it relates to the guy being interested in what his mother does and so on and so forth, sort of makes him hate sweets because
Mm.
he can't stand it. And so Ori understands early on that his job in the novel or the reader understands, is that his job in the novel is going to be, how is he going to resolve contradiction? And he has these rehearsals.
Right. No, that's very interesting. I didn't think of him as resolving contradictions, but certainly he's the governing consciousness. So all
Correct.
strands kind of come into his, and it's like it's a third person narration, but it's essentially like a first person narration because it's kind of
Right.
told in his head. So obviously, I think that the way he described the scene is kind of almost cinematized it, that there are three scenes going on. Absolutely right. I mean, the only thing that I can say is that I mean, I didn't obviously think of it quite like that, except I think you actually have read my writing style really accurately. I tend to have crisscrossing incidents happen
Yeah.
and they throw light on each other in weird ways, or just because we are in there. But
Hmm.
in this case, one particular theme that I think stands out to me is that, historical theme is that this is, late 80s, Calcutta, and there's this element of moral
Mm.
sort of governing of especially women's life. It's a communist rule, and this idea of propriety. And we all know it's a bit like Victorian England. Whenever there is a
Absolutely.
great degree of obsession with morality, there's always darkness. And I think this is what is happening. There's a kind of superego thing, that this obsession is there. It's like this almost Catholic obsession with, purity.
Purity.
There's always sin lurking, and that's another theme which obviously interests me. In Scent of God, I explored that, the idea of purity and sexuality coming together. But in
Right.
this case, obviously in the earlier scene you described, where this beauty parlor people are talking lewdly about, oh, this woman is clearly questionable, but they are interested in the
Right.
gossip value. What does she really do? And everybody's like
Absolutely.
all ears. So I think they really come together, and obviously sexual prudery and its relationship with sexual transgression is
Hmm.
actually I think, a theme here, as it is anywhere. Whenever
And
there's prudery, I believe there's always transgression lurking close by. And I think the connection you see is it does happen in Ori's head, and he can't figure out why is this happening, and why is this happening around his own mother,
mhm,
who's obviously on one hand his mother, but at the same time he has also himself transferred certain sexual feelings towards her without his knowing. So
absolutely. But let's just talk for just a minute, not for too long, about Ori's world, because after all, the reader is privy to his world, right? And as you said, I mean, it's not a first-person narration, but it is his world that we create with the writer, with the narrator. Um, because when you read a sentence like this, his mother had said was happy with his talking about Ahin, with his mouth full of laughter and beetle leaves only when he took his pills, but sometimes when he didn't, his shirt looked blood sprinkled, pan juice spilt through his mouth, and he did things that warmed your skin, made it flush. This sentence for me is like, how the heck did Ori say something like this? How did he even think something like this? And no, it's not a, it's not a critical question, but it's a question that's saying that there's a blend of so many people's perspective in that. It starts off with what Ori heard from his mother about Ohin, right? But it ends up giving us Ori's feeling of some kind of sexual awakening against his own will. It's sort of against his own will, right?
yeah, yeah,
And yet it's a feeling that he obviously has struck him as something exceptional, something transgressive, but something exceptional or special in some way.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I think
I, I
you've
think
read.
it's an amazing sentence. I think that whole paragraph's amazing. It just goes from one perspective. You think you're listening to Ori listening to his mother talking about Ahin, but then you end up with the end of the sentence. It's completely turned on its head because it's the most intimate Ori, Ori's view, intimate kind of way of getting to Ori's view of what happened.
Right,
Um,
right. No, I think you pointed out these kind of sentences, and they are, in a kind of technical sense, they flout the grammar of creative writing. And we talk about this, that you must be in somebody's point of view. You
yeah,
can't really switch points of view because it sounds sort of irrational. And yet, this is a instance where I guess I have unknowingly broken the rule, because I guess our point of view is never a pure thing. We
absolutely.
think,
I
but
mean, the
what
book would be really boring if you had written it purely from Ori's point of view. I mean, there's
Yeah,
no.
exactly, exactly. I mean, that's the third person clause, is it combines some of the power of the first person, but also has a little bit of latitude that you can step out. So it has a little bit of both. I mean, I started writing the novel in
Flaubert
the
did it, so you're allowed.
yeah, I hope so. Yeah, and yeah, there's a bleeding of different perspectives, and this kind of thing makes me uneasy, because sometimes it can not sound right, and yet I think the way you read it, it sounded so beautiful, because
Absolutely.
this is exactly how a child's mind gets corrupted, and this was very important for me to get this thing across, that he is getting corrupted because other people are corrupting him. And that is also coming through many layers, because it's all a kind of a grapevine. People are talking. I mean, this kind of corruption wouldn't happen if there aren't multiple people around, like nobody themselves will call it bad, but other people are calling it bad. So there's a looking around, and this slowly enters his perspective. And there's a shadow, and he still doesn't know what are those things that warms your skin. Those are still things. They are not named. So that's where he's a boy. He's a 10-year-old. So, but you're absolutely right. That's a kind of a transgressive point of view, which if I wrote knowingly, I would have probably hesitated. But that's where the writer gets away. The rules get away from you.
Well, yeah, I mean, and the rules, I mean, as I said, it would have made for a very boring kind of predictable kind of book if you had been true to the fact that you wouldn't say anything that Ori couldn't say.
Right.
I think that would have, I mean, I don't know whether that would have made it more real or realist, but it certainly would have made it less interesting. I want to shift the discussion just for a little bit. I don't want to keep you for too long. It's evening for you and it's morning for me here in Boston. Um, but I just wanted to bring you to speak a little bit about the framing of this book in the course that I'm teaching here and you're teaching, and we were supposed to teach together. So it's my version of it is Beyond Europe: Colonies, Literature, and the Making of Modernity.
Mhm.
And you touched upon it a little bit when you talked about Victorian culture and purity and stuff like that. But I also want to talk about it in the context of the theater, right? This context that you're, bringing to life is the dying art of the theater, but it's not street theater and Indian theater. It really is a British version of the proscenium stage that came, with colonialism, and that was taken up by bourgeois educated Indians, right? And used to different ends. Obviously, I mean, many of the early plays were anti-British. They were about independence, or in the period that you're talking about, many of them were about the new bourgeoisie and the new intellectual, the changes in education that brought about a flourishing of writing in English. So,
Mhm.
how do you sort of place this book in that type of context?
Right. I think
Or,
I
or,
think
or the ideas, yeah.
right. No, personally, I think this was the big leap. I mean, this came 8 years after my first novel. And I think in my first novel, as well as my first critical book, Prose of the World, I was very rooted in the idea of modernity. Modernity as a bourgeois European Enlightenment, and in the colony, something like the Bengal Renaissance, with which something I feel personally quite connected as somebody from Calcutta. And I think and that was the world of the prose, a certain quotidian sort of a world, Flannery, all these things which we connect with modernity. And then with this novel, suddenly a dam burst open, something broke, and the performative came in. Not just performative, I think of this novel as my non-modern novel, a modern
Tell
which
us about that, yeah.
my non-modern, because it's about very primitive things like Oedipal bonds, it's about death, and most importantly it's about performance which precedes modernity, precedes the enlightenment by millennia. I mean, even within the West alone, and if you go beyond the West, and this eruption of the non-modern, and something which has kept me preoccupied even in my third novel, where religion becomes that force that I kind of went beyond that. And I thought in some ways, one of the reasons I think the novel has resonated with people is that it tries to do something very contradictory. It tries to capture the soul of something wild and barbaric and non-modern in the structure of prose, which is of course a modern thing. It has the quotidian rationality of modernity, because I'm not a playwright. I can't act. I can't do any of those. I'm very kind of tuned to write prose. I think of myself very much as in the legacy of the Enlightenment, but somehow that contradiction I was able to, and later on there are scenes in the novel which are actually kind of almost enactments of theater scenes.
Hmm.
And of course it's not just what's happening on stage but happening outside. So that is a contradiction which I thought had a kind of an energy which sort of came within it. And
Hmm.
specifically, of course, there are so many traditions, but particularly two traditions. One is this tradition of decadent theater, which
Hmm.
goes back to the landed gentry and their connection with prostitution and a certain kind of
Right.
decadent lifestyle. But at the same time, the other hand, there's also this more left-leaning progressive theater, which was had found favor with the ruling party. So this theater was pushing the other theater away, and it's the life of an actress caught between the cracks. So in some ways, definitely theater is this performative genre is very important, but for me it was a huge almost a kind of a negative liberation, because it allowed me to become something I never thought I could be. Even as a person, I'm very much a kind of a calm, rational, modern kind of a person. I'm not the kind of person to go on sort of dance. And some writers are very good at that, dancing. And I'm not very good at that. I'm just not very at ease with my body in that sense. And yet there was something, that eruption of the physical, of the body, of performance, and a certain wilderness which precedes the rationality of modernity, which I obviously often talk about. So that's what happened, and that confusion is what sort of dooms the novel till the end.
Yeah, I really love what you just said. And, I'm trying to use this experience of reading with my students to bring them back to the discussion of the main theme of the course, without, without leading it in directions that it doesn't go. But I think what I find fascinating is that it is a novel of modernity on the surface, right? I mean, it's about the city, it's about prostitution, it's about the decadence of the middle class or the
Mhm.
dying middle class or an older kind of. So it has all of the trimmings that you need to categorize it as a novel of high modernity almost, right? I
Absolutely.
mean, it goes with the Balzacs and everybody
Very
very
much.
well.
It could be a
Uh,
Zola
it
kind of.
could be, and it has the party over
Yeah,
there, and it has.
yeah. The
But I think
mold.
it's the both the character of Ori, who just defies every logic, right? I mean, but more than him, I think it's his mother. It's his mother, I feel, who, while she's a prototype of the character, the actress caught in all of this, I think what she's able to unleash in her son is something primitive, something that goes beyond the logic of economics, the logic of inheritance. Those would be the themes, right? I mean, if he were to inherit something and then he were to kill his mother, but there's none of that logic provided in
Yeah,
her death.
yeah.
And
Absolutely,
that's
absolutely.
what takes it, lifts it out of the modernity trope,
Right, right. Of course, incest being right up there. I mean, not that
right?
incest is necessarily limited to the pre-modern. Incest can
No,
happen even
of
DHL
course.
is there, but that is right there, flouting of the
Hmm.
logic of inheritance of all of that. Whatever you just mentioned.
Hmm.
So you're absolutely right. She unleashes this in her son, and she herself is a bit of an ethereal, spiritual, sort of a distant figure, but it's really about her son and looking at her. And she has unleashed, by virtue of being in this theatrical figure, she has unleashed this very confusion between art and life,
Hmm.
completely flouts the logic of modernity, right? It
Hmm.
completely flouts it. And again, there are all kinds of other things, like how theater used to be in the past, and I'm not enough of a theater scholar to say that, but I know
Right.
that there are different kinds of theater had did not have a wall.
Yeah.
It had a continuity with the
With the
audience,
audience, yes.
and there are kinds of theater which had this, and there are different kinds of theater. So I think in some ways that bleeding, the breaking of the fourth wall, um, is also, also a very pre-modern thing, because I think, again, sort of speaking in a critical way, it's the enlightenment which really gave us the art space, that art belongs to a specific space.
Absolutely, and it's
It's
separate from life. And
separate, right? I mean, it's
I
not
mean, it
something
can
Shakespeare.
reflect life and it can critique life, but it's different. It's not the
Exactly.
same. Yeah.
Not the same, but and someone like Shakespeare didn't really know this. I mean, so in a way, yes, you're absolutely right. I think that's put beautifully, that it happens in the modern space, and yet something non-modern is unleashed, and the seed of that is in theater. But it's also these things of incest, there's things of death. These are primitive themes. These are primitive themes which just come to haunt, this modern late 20th century, boy and his family.
And I think that's what is so deeply troubling about the novel. That's what leaves you sort of, you don't have a sense of resolution, not just from the plot, but also from that disconnect that, these very recognizable features of modernity with which we're all familiar, because universally, people have read these great novels, people have watched these plays. We have a certain common understanding of what art is and what what the modern world is supposed to look like, but yet it leaves you deeply troubled because of, again, a kind of seepage of something non-modern that's interrupting and contaminating in some ways the
Right.
space of the modern,
Yeah.
the space that we all kind of control and understand to some degree
Right.
across
Now,
cultures.
now listening to you, I'm thinking of what I guess Dipesh Chakraborty has said, that time exists in
Time,
knots.
yeah.
And non-modern is always there. It's not like we pass from the non-modern to the modern, and the non-modern is all over.
Hmm.
We always have the non-modern, even in the middle of modernity. And these things specifically, theater, prostitution, these are obviously some of the oldest things in the world. Or for that matter, the suspicion of a very patriarchal suspicion of a woman's integrity, sexual integrity. These are things which have been there forever. And I guess the most disturbing thing is for me is how they're passed on to the son figure. In a
Hmm.
way, this is also about the making of a patriarch, how a
Right,
son sort of goes from being a son to becoming a patriarch, because that he's being given those values, and he
right.
in the end wants to
Embraces
control
them.
his mother too.
Yeah.
Yeah, he wants to control his mother too. I mean, it might be a son's possessiveness, but even in that there is that sense of the patriarch.
Hmm.
And these are things which are non-modern, these are, or rather these are transmodern. They've always been there.
Always, yeah.
And yet there's a certain bourgeois sensibility, a certain secular sensibility, which likes to think that, oh, we are better than these. We have
Hmm.
tamed these wild instincts, right?
Hmm.
And I think in many ways, the novel is a form which captures that, oh, we've succeeded. Think of Franco Moretti's
Right,
idea of novel as a bourgeois realism, as bourgeois reality principle, and all of that.
right.
And yet I guess something like Madame Bovary, I think, is in even in spirit captures that. But
Hmm.
there are novels which are modern in form
Hmm.
but not modern in spirit. There are
Hmm.
plenty of novels. I mean, D.H. Lawrence has written many novels,
Sure.
and I obviously didn't think of any of these while writing it, but more I reflected sort of back on it, I realized that's what happened.
Hmm.
That's exactly what happened with this novel. So you're absolutely right.
um I mean, there's a lot more we can say, but I want to bring this to a close, let you get to bed, and also not make this too long for either of our students. But I wondered whether you'd just say, like, in a sentence or two, in what ways you've moved away from some of the impulses we've talked about in this novel, or in what ways they are things that are pretty common and sort of the base of the way you think. Um,
Right, right. Well, I think this novel and The Scent of God as a kind of twin novels, because they are both kind of Bildungsroman, and The Scent of God, the boy is a bit older, so it's kind of, and just the way in this novel, it's theater. With Scent of God, it's about religion, and
right.
sexuality is a theme with both novels. And I think I was talking to a journalist, and I think in an interview, and they pointed out that, oh, you write this fail Bildungsromans where the Bildung doesn't happen, where you know there's a certain corruption of the self. You don't actually become this
To
responsible citizen.
evolve, you don't evolve
You
to a
don't
higher
evolve.
level.
So in this case, he becomes kind of like a psychological criminal or a sociopath or whatever. And of course, in the other novel, he sort of, his relationship with civil life or with normative sexuality changes. So I think of them as together.
Mhm.
Um, I think, and obviously these are very important themes for me, and it was a very important moment of discovery that I could transcend or disrupt this modernity with which I've always considered being in debt, and by made by this modernity, but to know that there's something in me which actually rails against this modernity, and I can write about it. And I've also written some essays about how these things can be brought back,
Yeah.
that this secular. But no, I think I've moved away, though. I think I'm just finishing up a novel which is um, a retelling of a myth, a retelling of the Ekalavya story.
Mm.
How the Ekalavya story, as well as Plato's Symposium, because the subject of this novel is actually the teacher-student relationship and what are the sort of the limits in terms of power, intimacy, and all that. And I guess there, I started with the Ekalavya story, so I still have the pre-modern haunts me, and I guess it's a bit like kind of this bourgeois romance of the peasantry, like the modern person's romance of the non-modern, that, oh, there's some fascinating things. And yes, so I think they're there, but I think with those two novels, I was in a kind of intense relationship with this sort of transgressive,
Mm-hmm.
uh, dangerous, non-modern themes, which I, I mean I mean, that phase, I might come back to it again, or it's probably always there. But those two novels definitely at the peak. Like my first novel, which I am not very fond of, was, it's very much in that anthropological moment of observing urban modernity, Flannery, everything. So whereas from second and third novels, that definitely have that
Mm-hmm.
engagement, those themes. So
So
yes.
when can we expect the new novel? Maybe I
I don't
might
know. The
ask.
world is falling apart right now. So whether people have the time to think about novels, but I'm finishing up. I've
Wow.
revised kind of. I'm thinking it will probably be out um, end of next year or very early 22.
Okay.
Um, it's got some Wellesley in it. So
Oh, wow. How did you bring those together? But anyway.
well, it's half of it is set in the US, so it's sort
Okay.
of moves between the US and India, and it's about a woman, actually. It's about a woman poet who's also a teacher,
Mm,
and it's about how one can teach and sort of reenact the story of Plato's Symposium of an intense relationship with one student, but at the same time enact the Dronacharya Arjun Ekalavya story that when you face. And I think this is a pressing issue in our campuses everywhere, that
mm-hmm.
what happens when a student comes not from a certain kind of privilege. So
Right, right. Yeah.
your relationship. So those things have found its way in the novel. So, but it's a contemporary novel. It's the most contemporary of all my novels. It's set
Wow.
actually in the present, but it has echoes from, because mentorship again is, I think, a transmodern theme. It's like,
Hmm.
it's been going on forever. So
And as liberal arts people, you know that we try to, we try to imitate that form of mentorship in our institutions. I don't know how
yes,
successful we are, but that is sort of the logic behind it, right? In many
yes,
ways, is that
absolutely.
it's um,
Pastoral care and that kind of a thing. So yeah, it's really asked those disturbing questions about who you mentor and who you can mentor,
mhm,
and what are even the limits of that mentorship
correct.
relationship. So
That's
it's
interesting. I mean, there are seeds of it though already. It's really interesting to hear you talk about your work because there are seeds of it already from, right from Firebird to Scent of God. So in some ways,
yes.
you sort of you test out little ideas and then you pick them up again and then you go much further. I love that way.
I think
But
education is the running theme in my work. It's something I'm interested in. I've written about it outside, but
yeah,
education is a kind of running theme. I mean, in these two novels, education of the protagonist, but this
right.
this novel is actually about education
About
and
education. Yeah.
set in colleges. So it's actually very much,
Well, I mean,
theme.
so is Scent of God though. I mean, it's literally set in an
Yes,
educational
it
institution.
is sent in a school, but yeah, definitely. And Scent of God, I think the mentorship theme starts
Is
to play a role.
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
so definitely. So there is a connection.
Well, Shoika, thank you so much for this. And I will keep you posted about how this turns out and where we get to use it.